there, welcome back to Cinema Rolls, your go-to channel for movie comparisons. Today, we're continuing our search for the origins of the 1970 hit movie MASH, starring Donald Sutherland, Elliott Gould, and Tom Skerritt. Now, the origins of MASH should be a no-brainer, right? I mean, after all, it's based on the 1968 novel by Richard Hooker, and that in turn is based on Richard Hooker's experience in a MASH unit in the Korean War. But we did manage to find some striking similarities between MASH and the 1953 Humphrey Bogart movie Battle Circus. If you missed that comparison, you'll want to check it out. The link's in the description below. While I was doing my research for that video, I ran across an insightful article written by Michael Hiltzik and published in the LA Times and other places back in 2019 that briefly compared MASH to, ta-da, Catch-22. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. The novel Catch-22 by Joseph Heller was originally published in 1961. It's about a bombardier stationed in Italy during World War II who's determined to get himself declared insane so he can get a discharge and avoid being killed in the war. Ironically, even though Catch-22 was published about 7 years before Hooker's novel MASH, MASH beat Catch-22 to the movie theaters by a few months and became an instant hit, leaving Catch-22 to wither in its shadow. But according to Hiltzik's article, Catch-22 the book proved to be a much bigger influence on MASH the movie than on its own film adaptation. That intrigued me because I noticed some similarities between the two myself, or at least I thought I had, probably because I was more familiar with MASH the TV series than I was with the movie. And the character of Corporal Maxwell Klinger is the perfect embodiment of the concept of Catch-22. If you're not familiar with the concept, this conversation between the bombardier Yossarian, played by Alan Arkin, and Dr. Nika, played by Jack Gilford, should make it perfectly clear.
Okay, let me see if I got this straight. In order to be grounded, I've got to be crazy. And I must be crazy to keep flying. But if I ask to be grounded, that means I'm not crazy anymore and I have to keep flying.
You've got it. That's Catch-22. That's some catch like Catch-22. It's the best there is.
In other words, Catch-22 is just a glorified way of saying damned if you do, damned if you don't. And if you've ever watched any of the earlier seasons of the MASH TV series, then you're already familiar with the character of Corporal Maxwell Klinger. You know, the guy who dresses in women's clothing in order to get a Section 8 and secure his discharge.
I play with dolls. My last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
Klinger, that outfit might just get you that Section 8.
I made it just for this occasion, sir. Who put gasoline in my gasoline?
Klinger, I'm the first to say you're a fine medic and a snappy dresser.
I try, sir.
I've always thought he must be based on Yossarian, and I was pretty optimistic about my chances of finding his predecessor in MASH the movie. But I was disappointed. There is no such character in the entire movie or even in the book. So then I took a look at some of the other characters that I thought might be analogous. The first Catch-22 character that I looked at was the character of Milo Minderbinder. What a name. Played by John Voight. This guy turned the war into a huge business venture, running a black market trade in everything from eggs to Egyptian cotton.
A fresh egg, sir! Where did you get the egg? In Malta, sir! At 5 cents apiece, with a clear profit of 2 cents per egg! There are tremendous profits to be made, Colonel.
And he's willing to trade just about anything to get his hands on the next hot product.
If I could take one of the planes this afternoon, I'd like to get this material over to Alexandria. There's a huge cotton crop this year. We'll trade for it, sir.
With what?
4,000 yards of silk.
How in the world did you get hold of so much silk?
Where the hell's my parachute?
And when the cotton crop doesn't pan out quite the way he had anticipated, he gets pretty creative in finding alternative uses for it.
What is it?
Chocolate-covered cotton.
What are you, crazy?
No good, huh? Is it really that bad?
It's cotton!
His character is so exaggerated that he will stop at nothing in order to make a profit. He does business with heads of state all over Europe, including with the Germans, during World War II. And he has his own base bombed in order to unload his cotton with the cooperation of Colonel Cathcart and at the behest of the Germans.
our storehouse is at the end of the field. Direct hit on the mess hall, if you please.
What's good for M&M Enterprises, it's good for the airport. We had to get rid of that cotton. The Germans promised to take it off our hands if we ran this mission for them.
As Milo is fond of saying, what's good for the company, his company, is good for everyone, because they all supposedly have a share in the company, even though nobody ever seems to see any returns except for Milo. And it's even worse in the book, where everyone seems to work for Milo and he wields more power than the heads of state that he does business with. In fact, his character seems to be more of a personification of the nascent military-industrial complex than a realistic personality. For a parallel character in MASH, I looked at Radar O'Reilly, who I remember from the TV show as always being able to procure things, either through his friend Sparky or on the black market. But in MASH the movie, the only hint that we have of this is when the OR runs out of blood in the middle of a surgery, and Radar manages to procure just what they need from Colonel Henry Blake, who is passed out in his tent.
I know, honey. Go back to sleep.
E negative has been cross-matched.
You said you didn't have any blood, baby.
Found a donor.
Other than that, there's really nothing about acquiring goods from the black market or elsewhere in the movie. And in the TV series, although wheeling and dealing with Sparky was commonplace for Radar, and the doctors and other MASH personnel often had to resort to the black market to get what they needed, it usually has something to do with procuring medical supplies that are in short supply rather than for personal gain. Like the time that Hawkeye and Trapper trade Henry Blake's antique desk for a supply of hydrocortisone, or when Father Mulcahy trades Charles Winchester's vintage wine for some much-needed anesthetic. Of course, Radar has the most experience with wrangling needed goods, as he explains when Klinger is unable to replace a stolen generator in his absence. As he explains, it's only a 3-call finagle.
I don't know what the big deal is anyway. A generator's only a 3-call finagle. I mean, a couple of boxes of toilet paper here, a can ham there.
So the whole subject of war profiteering is missing in MASH the movie, and in the TV series, as I mentioned, the wheeling and dealing is usually all about medical supplies and not about personal gain. So in this way, MASH is a lot less cynical than Catch-22. So, having struck out with my first 3 character comparisons, I thought I'd try my hand with the commanding officers. In Catch-22, this is Colonel Cathcart, played by Martin Balsam. This man is obsessed with getting a promotion, making a name for himself, and trying to get featured in the Saturday Evening Post.
I see no reason why the Saturday Evening Post should not be interested in the story of my outfit.
How does he hope to attract their attention?
I want you to think of some nice, snappy prayers that'll send the officers out feeling good. Your business is to think of some short, catchy prayers that'll get me into the Saturday Evening Post.
And that's not all. In order to glorify himself, he keeps increasing the number of bombing missions that his men have to fly every time they start approaching the number that would earn them a rotation, which is what Yossarian is railing against throughout the entire movie and what sets him off on his mission to get declared insane.
I've flown 35 missions, for Christ's sake.
2 more missions and we're on our way home.
I've flown 55 missions. I've been fighting for my country for 3 years. Now I'm going to stop fighting for myself.
As of now, the number of missions required before you are eligible for rotation is raised to 75.
Cathcart raised the number of missions to 80.
Of course he has his reasons.
Want to make you feel proud to know that you served in an outfit that averaged more combat missions per person than any other.
And he always has the best interests of his men at the forefront of his mind.
I want to wish you good luck on today's mission. To those of you who won't be coming back, I'd like to say we're going to do our best to take care of your wives and/or sweethearts.
Aw, isn't that sweet?
And don't forget, General Treadle wants to see a nice, tight bombing pattern on those aerial photographs.
So that's what's really important to him. And he's not above joining in with Milo in his business ventures.
Oranges from Marrakesh and pecan.
Pecan!
And in Palermo, sir, 10,000 gallons of the finest Italian olive oil. The Sicilians need blankets. There's an interested party in Sardinia.
At first glance, Colonel Henry Blake from MASH, played by Roger Bowen, would appear to be a somewhat watered-down version of Colonel Cathcart, except for the ambition. But what he lacks in ambition, he makes up for in a lack of ambition. Yeah, wrap your head around that one. Henry's usually found tying flies,
2 waiting for the IV and 2 waiting for the antibiotics to take over.
Well, we can probably handle that if there's no more choppers.
in bed with a nurse,
A little more wine, my dear?
Yes, please.
or trying not to deal with staff issues that he'd rather not deal with.
Listen, about last night, sir, there was nothing I could do about it, sir.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Well, it couldn't have been helped.
But the most interesting thing about Henry Blake is not the very slight parallel that we see between his character and that of Colonel Cathcart, but the fact that the Henry Blake from the book version of MASH was not a goof-off, but a regular Army type. In fact, if anything, Colonel Sherman Potter from the TV series played by Harry Morgan was a better match with the book than the movie was.
Colorful officers, I must say. Well, that is one thing I do not need. I would greatly appreciate it if for the next 18 months you keep your noses clean.
So, were the screenwriters for MASH the movie trying to emulate the spirit of Colonel Cathcart's character? They both seem pretty oblivious to the actual war going on around them. And while Catch-22 in both its book and movie incarnations displays the lunacy of war and the military mindset through just about every character, the book that MASH was based on showed more balance among its characters. But MASH the movie only had stray characters to provide something for the loonies to push back against.
A bunch of the boys asked me to ask you, Frank, what Potnips was like in the sack. You know, was she...
Your own business.
No, Frank, is she better than self-abuse? Somebody get that dirty old man out of this operating theater.
Dirty old man. I'm Colonel Merrill.
Who am I? I am the pro from Dover,
Well,
and
I
this
don't
is my
believe you.
favorite
You can't
caddy.
go until I call Captain Peterson.
Ravage your body, lady. You're
I'll
a
call the
pretty
police.
lady.
You can't come in here.
Lady,
I'm
gonna
gonna call Captain Peterson. You stay away
and I'm
from me.
gonna swallow it and chew it.
So, if the individual characters didn't bring us any closer to understanding why so many people seem to think that MASH emulates Catch-22, then what is it? I was beginning to think that the two movies don't really have that much in common after all. But since it had been decades since I'd read Catch-22, I decided to reread it and to reread MASH as well. And I was just gobsmacked when I read this statement right in the introduction to MASH. And I quote, "MASH, with its Osterizer blend of black humor and stark horror, is a direct descendant of Catch-22. Ironically, that movie appeared the same year as Mike Nichols' film version of Catch. MASH is the better movie by far." End quote. I don't know that I'd agree that MASH was the better movie. More on that later. But I was intrigued enough to dig deeper and see if I could uncover the connections that everyone else seemed to have found. Of course, the statement I just read gives us the first clue. The blend of black humor and stark horror. This is very evident in both movies for sure.
More of that garlic stuff.
Stick or otherwise.
Big, honey. It's, things...
Although, in Catch-22, the two often overlap.
Look, his mother and his father and his brother flew all the way here. They know he's dying.
So what do you want me to do?
Be him.
Harvey?
My name is Yossarian.
His name's Yossarian, Ma.
Looks so bad.
He's very sick, Pa. Doctor says he's gonna die.
Harvey?
Ma, his name's Yossarian. He doesn't remember things too good anymore.
She can call me Harvey if she wants.
Harvey?
Don't worry, Yossarian. Everything's gonna be all right.
But there are a lot of movies that do the same thing, so it seemed to me like this was less a sign that MASH was emulating Catch-22 than it was an acknowledgement that war is terrifying and people sometimes use dark humor to deal with it. So, is there anything else? I decided to delve deeper. First of all, I compared the storylines of the two movies. That is, if you can actually say that either of them really has a storyline in the traditional sense, where you have a starting point that leads you to the conclusion through a series of escalating events and mounting tension. In MASH, the storyline goes something like this. Hawkeye and Duke arrive at the 407 7th and meet Trapper.
Is there some reason my friend should not know the name of the hospital?
That's followed by lots of sophomoric antics.
Frank, oh Frank, my lips are hot. Oh, kiss my hot lips. Oh, hot.
We have got to share this with the rest of the camp.
Bickersons, I love them.
Oh, Frank.
Huh? The battling Bickersons, I love.
I want sex. Bring me some sex. No, that one. Bring me that one. Congratulations. That one, the sultry bitch with the fire in her eyes.
In between lots of meatball surgery with fluctuating high and low points, but nothing that really stands out as an actual climax until Hawk and Duke are discharged and leave the MASH unit and Trapper stays behind. If we stick with this skeletal approach, then the storyline for Catch-22 is pretty similar. Doc Tanika introduces Yossarian to the concept of Catch-22. Then we see lots of insane antics both on the part of Yossarian and on the part of the other characters, and in between there are lots of bombing missions and attempts by Yossarian to get himself out of flying them by appearing insane and feigning sickness, with some recurring sequences, but again, nothing that really stands out as a climax, until Yossarian finally comes up with a way out. So unlike most other war movies, where the protagonists have some mission to accomplish and everything leads up to that moment where they either achieve their goal or fail, the story arcs of these two movies are relatively flat with a few undulations here or there, which, when you think about it, is kind of the way real life is, especially in a war when your main concern is surviving day to day and dealing with whatever life throws at you in the moment. In fact, if I looked at my own life, I'd be hard-pressed to find any overarching storyline. I've done a lot of different things with some highs and lows, but I can't say that anything has been building up to any specific outcome. Although maybe there have been some mini-story arcs at different points in my life. How about you? Can you look at your life and see a movie plot, or does it just sort of meander from one event to another? Now, back to our stories. Other than the flat storylines, MASH and Catch-22 are very different movies, at least on the surface. Not only do they deal with different wars, but the main characters have a different purpose. MASH follows 3 Army surgeons in a mobile Army surgical hospital who often have the upper hand over the higher-ups in the hierarchy because of their outstanding skills as meatball surgeons. In other words, they're there to save lives, and because they are seen as indispensable, they can get away with just about anything.
Apparently some big heart surgeon in Boston told the congressman the only man to take care of his son is Captain John McIntyre.
Your boys blew this case, and we bailed you out. Now, we are going to stay here for one more day and check out the congressman's kid and get in some golf for ourselves.
On the other hand, Catch-22 shows us World War II through the eyes of a bombardier whose official purpose in the war is to take lives by dropping bombs. And not only does he not have the upper hand, he feels that he's at the mercy of people who are intent on killing him, and not just the enemy, but the Air Force itself, which keeps putting him in harm's way, precisely because he is seen as absolutely disposable, which is exactly what keeps him beholden to Catch-22. And he seems to be one of the only sane people on a base full of people who, for the most part, seem to be oblivious to the horrors happening around them and/or see the war as a tool for their own personal gain in one way or another.
A little time and the plan. I have one at my disposal. I can get the gas back.
Well, all right.
Each of these two movies follow their respective books fairly closely in terms of storyline. Catch-22 is almost a blow-by-blow reproduction of the book, and even maintains its circular timeline while MASH takes a few more liberties. And yet, the movie Catch-22 has a much different feel from the book it's based on. In the movie, Catch-22's circular timeline and surreal atmosphere almost gives a sensation of watching someone else's recurring hallucination, with more and more being revealed with each iteration. In this scene at the beginning of the movie, Yossarian is stabbed by an unknown assailant. This scene immediately fades into another oft-repeated scene in The Bomber. Until everything was revealed at the end of the movie, I was never really sure if the bombardier scene was a hallucination that Yossarian was having while he was in the hospital recovering from the stab wound, or if it really happened. But it was very clear in the book, which is very pragmatic in its descriptions of events and doesn't tend to dramatize things. But the book was way more popular than the movie, and we'll come back to why that might be a little later. The movie Catch-22 seems to be trying to weave a more coherent storyline than what was in the book, because even though Yossarian is definitely the protagonist in the book as well, each chapter there is dedicated to a different character, so Yossarian isn't front and center all the time, even though we do keep coming back to him. But in the movie, Yossarian's mission of getting himself a discharge is really what drives the film forward, even though all the other characters and situations are very much present. And I think that's why I enjoyed the movie much more than the book as a whole. Now, getting back to MASH, on the surface, it would seem that the non-existent storyline in MASH reflects the stream of consciousness style of writing that Joseph Heller used in Catch-22. Except that Heller actually knew where he was going with the story, and the circular storyline was used to show the same events from different chronological perspectives, almost reflecting the way our minds tend to go back over and over some troubling event in our past, haunting us until we can come up with some plausible reason for why it happened or find some deeper meaning in it. I didn't recognize a similar depth in MASH, which is not necessarily to say it wasn't there, but if it was, I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments, right? Another interesting theme that sometimes crops up in war movies is the treatment of women. In MASH, it seems that the women are mostly there as playthings for the men.
Check this place out. See what the nurses are like, huh?
The nurses are often seen in bed with the doctors.
I'm married, I'm happy, I love my wife. If she was here, I would be with her. There is no question of loving anybody. It is a question.
A little more wine, my dear?
Yes, please.
God meant us to find each other.
His will be done.
And then there's this notable scene where Hawkeye convinces a nurse to do a service to mankind by giving the suicidal dentist a reason to live.
No, you've got to look on this as a nurse. It's a painless, needs it for therapeutic value. It will help him, and it certainly wouldn't do you any harm either.
And of course, there's the famous shower scene where the whole camp is watching as the nurse's shower tent is brought down with Margaret Houlihan in the shower. But in MASH, at least they tip their hats to the valuable work that the nurses do.
Hot Lips, you may be a pain in the ass, but you're a damn good nurse.
In Catch-22, on the other hand, there are not a lot of women around. There are a couple of nurses, but this is not a medical unit, so there are just a few, and they don't figure big in the overall plot. Except in this notable scene where Yossarian tries to make the moves on Nurse Duckett.
Keep your head down between your legs. Try to breathe deeply and evenly. I'm sorry, Captain.
That was probably the most MASH-like scene in the entire movie. I just love the way she keeps up her professional demeanor while letting him have it. In Catch-22, the woman that we see the most of is the one that's referred to as Nately's whore, his fiancée, because she works as a prostitute. Now, I understand that Catch-22, the book, has been removed from some school libraries because they say that it refers to women as whores, and I just want to set the record straight. It does not refer to all women as whores. It refers specifically to this woman as a whore because of her occupation. It's still pretty judgmental. I mean, considering especially that a war was on and women may not have had a lot of alternatives to keep food in their mouths. So from now on, I'll just refer to her as Nately's fiancée. And as we see here, she has a very unique attitude about the relationship between money and sex.
For how much?
$30.
I'll pay for all of us.
Why don't you give her the $30 and send the other two away?
Because then she'll be angry with me for making her work for her money. She said that if I really loved her, I'd send her away and sleep with the other two.
but Nately is madly in love with her.
As of now, the number of missions required before you are eligible for rotation is raised to 75.
What are you smiling at, you silly bastard? Now I won't have to go home. You what? I can stay here. I don't have to leave her. What are you saying? I love her.
Now that's true love. But her love for him seems more motherly than amorous.
I really do. Honest to God, I never felt anything like this before, not even for my mom.
He is, after all, literally her meal ticket. And when Yossarian goes to tell her that Nately's been killed in Milo's bombing spree, she goes berserk and blames Yossarian, because he's just one more man participating in the war that needlessly killed her lover. So she makes several attempts to get her revenge by killing him too. And I think in a way she almost personifies the war itself for Yossarian, who's convinced that the war is trying to kill him. At the beginning of the movie, it's not clear who the assailant is, but the book makes it very clear right from the very beginning. Eventually, someone picks her up in a helicopter and drops her off somewhere far, far away where she can do no harm. A disposable woman, much like Yossarian personifies the disposable soldier. Isn't that the ultimate message of war? That human beings are disposable. Of course, having it explained in the book after having already seen the movie was kind of an aha moment for me. But I kind of like the not knowing, because the dreamlike quality allowed me to try and fill in the blanks and guess at what was going on in Yossarian's psyche, like an elaborate psychodrama that caused him to have this delusion while he was in the hospital. And it seemed obvious to me that it was a dramatization of his feeling that everyone was out to kill him. So there's an example of an interpretation that the author maybe didn't intend, but does that make it any less valid? If you've seen this movie, how did you interpret the recurring sequences? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And right after Yossarian leaves her, trying to distance himself from her accusing voice calling him an assassin, he has a long, lonely walk through the streets of the town, bearing witness to a string of senseless acts of violence which seem to reflect the senseless violence of war itself, and culminates in perhaps the most disturbing scene concerning the treatment of women in Catch-22, which is Arpy's rape and murder of an innocent young girl.
I only raped her once.
You killed her?
Well, I had to do that after I raped her. I couldn't very well let her go around saying bad things about me, could I?
Arthur, you insane? They're gonna throw you in jail. You just killed the girl. You threw her out the window. She's lying out there in the street!
He has no right to be there, you know. It's after curfew.
Although extremely twisted, Arpy's defense when Yossarian tells him they're going to hang him gives us pause for thought.
I don't think they'd make such a fuss over one Italian girl when thousands of lives are being lost every day.
You can't take the life of another human being and get away with it. Don't you understand that? They're coming to get you!
You can't take the life of another human being and get away with it. But isn't that what Yossarian himself and all the rest of them are doing every day? And it takes the death of this one girl to make us see how criminal that is. Because when we see her as an individual, we feel the full impact of the tragedy. But when it's dozens or hundreds or thousands of anonymized, faceless people, day in and day out, it loses its impact. Anyway, the womanizing in MASH seems pretty tame by comparison, doesn't it? Of course, in typical Catch-22 style, it's Yossarian who discovers the crime, who gets arrested for being out after curfew, rather than the murderer being arrested for his crime.
Captain Yossarian?
Yes?
You're under arrest.
But
You're AWOL.
I think both this murder scene and the one showing the grief of Nately's fiancé are poignant reminders of the different ways that women can suffer from war as much as the men who fight in them. There are many other movies that deal with that specifically, like Casualties of War, for example. Would you like to see us do a comparison of that kind of movie in the future? Let me know in the comments. In the end, I think the strongest parallels found between the two movies were the overall feel and the circular logic employed by most of the characters. And I think that's where we're going to start seeing what other people have seen. As I read Catch-22, This lack of a compelling, overarching storyline that tied everything together made it hard for me to keep my interest, although there were individual smaller storylines such as Yossarian's attempt to get grounded and Milo Minderminder's profiteering activities that would keep my interest for shorter periods of time. I think it was written that way intentionally because it was meant to reflect life as experienced by the soldiers themselves, who were more concerned with the day-to-day business of survival. As someone who's never been in the military myself, much less a war, the format didn't really appeal to me. But it's not surprising that this book was a huge hit with soldiers on deployment, because it reflected the life they were living with all the absurd red tape and bureaucracy and the individual military ambitions that at times could be far removed from the overall war effort and yet have a huge impact on the soldiers themselves. As I mentioned before, Catch-22 the movie is literally very faithful to the book, and some of the conversations are nearly word-for-word reproductions, but the movie attempted to achieve two things that the book didn't. One of those things was trying to make sense out of a senseless situation. In other words, it emphasized the story arc that was there but wasn't really prominent in the book. And yet, in some ways, it was less clear than the book. For example, the movie only mentions who it was that stabbed Yossarian in an offhand comment by Yossarian himself, where there's a good deal of narrative dedicated to that story in the book. And it doesn't at all clarify why we keep coming back to that scene where Yossarian is being told to help the bombardier. In the movie, scenes like this are given a dreamlike quality that hints at a deeper psychological reason for what we're seeing, and we're never really sure if it's something that happened in the real world or only in Yossarian's head. In fact, I went through most of the movie thinking that Snowden, the bombardier that Yossarian was supposed to help, was a dream persona of Yossarian himself. But the book didn't impart that same dreamy quality. The story was presented as a stripped-down, real-life memory that kept playing over and over again in Yossarian's head. Just like in the book, the movie reveals a little more each time it replays the scene, but we don't get the same explicit revelation that we get in the book, although it's not really spelled out for us there either, that this is the moment where Yossarian really comes face to face with his own mortality. Instead, like most movies, it shows rather than tells. First, it gives us a clue as to the identity of the assailant. See if you can catch it. Assassin! And then, just like in the beginning of the movie, that scene ingeniously fades into the recurring scene in the bomber, connecting these two incidents to Yossarian's existential crisis. And this is what begins his mission to get himself declared insane so he doesn't have to go on any more missions. Obviously, there's not a parallel scene in MASH, but MASH doesn't make the mistake of trying to create an overarching story that didn't exist in either of the two books. It simply begins with Hawkeye and Duke's arrival at the 407 7th and ends with their departure. Everything that happens in between is somewhat loose and disjointed and sort of episodic. So we have such disparate events as the arrival of Hawk's old buddy Trapper John, the trio's harassment of Margaret and Frank, the faux suicide of Painless the Dentist, Ho-John's draft evasion, Hawk and Trapper's trip to Tokyo, and the big football match with another MASH unit. And through it all, the only unifying thread consists of the daily heroics in the OR and the continual coming and going of military personnel, either through death, discharge, or transfer. Nobody seems to have any particular goal that runs through the entire movie. So, in terms of plot, MASH only emulates Catch-22 in the sense that it doesn't really have one, and in the sense that it takes aim at the senselessness of war. And where Catch-22 uses this circular chronology that keeps coming back to the same point in time and revealing a bit more each time, kind of mimicking the way the human mind keeps revisiting past experiences, MASH keeps to a linear storyline. But even though Heller's book does have the continuous thread of Yossarian's goal to get out of flying more missions, everything between the beginning and the end still feels loose and disjointed, with micro-stories focusing on one character at a time. And this is how MASH emulates it. It captures the overall feel and doesn't try to impose rationality on an irrational situation. Another thing that MASH does a very good job of emulating in Catch-22 is a circular logic that marks many of the conversations between the characters. For example, this excerpt from the book. What makes you so sure Major Major is a communist? He never began denying it until we began accusing him, and you never see him signing any of our loyalty oaths. You aren't letting him sign any. Of course not. That would defeat the whole purpose of our crusade. Of course, the most obvious example of circular logic in Catch-22 is Catch-22 itself. The more Yossarian tries to get out of flying bombing missions by trying to convince people he's insane, the more likely he is to have to fly more missions because the mere fact of wanting to get out of it and preserve his own life proves that he's actually sane. Catch-22 the movie is full of Catch-22s in miniature, and while MASH doesn't indulge in quite this brand of humor, it has its own signature type of verbal silliness, but I have to say, I think it pales in comparison.
You got a persecution card.
You're damn right I am.
You admit it! I admit I'm being persecuted. What is McWatt? Those bastards are trying to kill me!
No one's trying to kill you, sweetheart.
Then why are they shooting at me, Milo?
They're shooting at everyone, Yossarian.
And what difference does that make?
Just suppose everyone thought the same way you do.
Then I'd be a damn fool to think any different.
This kind of philosophical, political commentary is all but missing in MASH, but these next examples show more similarities in the humor of the two movies.
Captain Hawkeye Pierce, I had a twix about you. It seems that you stole a Jeep up at headquarters.
No, sir. No, I didn't steal a Jeep. No, it's right outside, right there.
Oh, so it is.
Sergeant, from now on, I don't want anyone to come in and see me while I'm in my office.
What do I say to people who want to come in and see you while you're in your office?
Tell them I'm in and ask them to wait.
For how long?
Until I've left.
May I send people in to see you after you've left?
Yes.
You won't be here then, will you?
No.
I want you to marry me.
You can't want to marry me because I'm not a virgin. Nobody wants to marry with a girl who's not a virgin.
I do. I want to marry you.
Not possible.
Why not?
Because you're crazy.
Why am I crazy?
Because you want to marry me.
Wait, you won't marry me because I'm crazy, and you say I'm crazy because I want to marry you, right?
See?
Here's an example from MASH that's more of an anti-Catch-22. Some circular logic that, unlike a straightforward Catch-22, leads to a win-win situation.
I cannot give absolution to a man who is about to commit suicide. It's a mortal sin.
Look, Dago, he is not committing suicide. He is only intending to commit suicide. So you're not dealing with an act, you're dealing with an intention. And if it works, if what we're doing works, then he will not commit suicide, so therefore you are preventing a mortal sin, okay?
See what I mean? Each of these examples from Catch-22 is a Catch-22 in miniature. Now, given all this twisted logic in both movies, does that mean that MASH was trying to emulate Catch-22? Or is it just a reflection of the kind of logic that you're likely to encounter in the military, or by extension, in any hierarchical, authoritarian, or bureaucratic organization? That could go a long way toward explaining why both of the books that these movies were based on, particularly Catch-22, were so very popular with people who actually had military experience or were currently serving in the military at the time the books came out. So, can we get away with saying that MASH the movie was based on the book Catch-22? I tend to think not. I think the similarities are more a reflection of what was going on at the time. They both came out in 1970, just a year after the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War had reached its peak, and many people were questioning that involvement, particularly those who were being asked to put their lives on the line for an ideal that they may not have believed in. And some of the protests took on an absurdist approach as well. The example that sticks out the most in my mind is the fact that a lot of peace activists took to wearing military garb. In fact, in the early 70s, olive drab and camouflaged M65 Army jackets, and even Navy-style peacoats, were pretty much standard fare among both high school and college students. And come to think of it, even in my junior high as well. And they often had patches sewn on them with the emblematic peace sign. The idea apparently originated with returning Vietnam War vets who became part of the pacifist and hippie movements as a reaction to the traumatic impact of what they had both witnessed and participated in during the war. And so it became a way that the protesters had of thumbing their noses not only at military authority, but also at the war itself and everything it stood for. And in a way, you could look at the whole counterculture movement that sprang up during the 60s and 70s as a protest not only against the war, but of everything that had been set up by the establishment. And this was expressed in music, clothing, new forms of spirituality, in other words, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I think that accounts for the popularity of the movie MASH. But Catch-22 was so over the top compared to MASH. It took everything so much further, and the absurdity was so much more absurd. Which begs the question of why the movie was such a box office flop compared to MASH, especially when you consider how popular the book was back then and still continues to be. In fact, over 60 years later, Catch-22 is still selling something like 58,000 books a year. The only explanation I've been able to find was that Catch-22 was released a few months after movie audiences had already fallen in love with MASH, and so they must have been expecting a similar type of black comedy from Catch-22, but the tones of the two movies are so different, and MASH is definitely the lighter of the two. Catch-22 requires the viewer to go a little deeper and ponder some things that may be uncomfortable to think about. Or maybe the ruthless horror of the war as portrayed in Catch-22 cut a little too close to the bone for an audience made up of people who were facing the very real possibility of being shipped off to die in a war themselves. Either way, I think that Catch-22 deserves a second viewing after all these years. And while both MASH and Catch-22 are still very relevant movies, and I enjoyed both of them, I felt that MASH didn't quite hold up as well, because a lot of the pranks seemed a little sophomoric by today's standards, or maybe it's just an age thing. But in contrast, Catch-22 seems to have grown in poignancy and offers so much more food for thought. In the end, I guess it's a matter of what you're looking for in a movie, but whatever your taste, I think you almost couldn't go wrong with these two as a double feature. So that wraps up today's analysis. As always, if you have thoughts on either of these two movies or how they compare, please share them in the comments. Your ideas are important and they really enrich the experience of everyone who watches these videos. And I hope you'll join us next time as we move away from the Korean War and on to the Cold War by taking an in-depth look at the gripping 1964 movie Failsafe and its remake, which was broadcast live on TV in the year 2000. I'm really looking forward to digging into this one, and I hope you are too. Until then, stay safe and keep watching movies.